And that's that I want to draw a distinction between public space and common space. I would say that much of what has been assumed about this conversation, or what I hear in discussions about public space, is correct and good, which is to say that public space is absolutely critical to the health of a city. And in many ways, the health of a city's democracy is contingent upon the health of its public spaces. But if that democracy, if that culture, if that social milieu is going to become actually participatory, that is to say, if it's going to become available to everyday people, then that space has to turn into places. That is to say, it has to turn into common places. It has to turn into places that are commonly understood, commonly inhabited, and commonly controlled. And that kind of everyday inhabiting of common space, it can't be managed. It can't be controlled. It can't be planned for. And it most certainly can't be choreographed, as much as many public officials might like to think that they're able to. How the public space becomes actually commonly inhabited, is complex and variegated, and in some ways kind of enigmatic. But I'm going to suggest to you two small things that might maybe contribute to that. The first is to say that public space, when it becomes restricted, it becomes antiseptic, it becomes scarcely inhabited when it's overly controlled and overly managed. And Vancouver is infamous for that. It is infamous for its inability to allow certain kinds of mess, for certain kinds of public participation, for certain kinds of unofficial or vernacular activity to flourish. So I would say the first piece in allowing public spaces to become common are to allow them to become messy. And for that we have to have a cultural and a social, but also a political willingness to accept a certain degree of mess. That is to say, a certain kind of unpredictableness, a certain kind of things that you may not expect to happen, a certain number of things that city planners, that city managers may not even particularly like. And part of that is the magic of the city. To say that a lot of ways we're in a city because we inhabit a city to find things that are not like us. The magic of a city is to run into people who don't look like us, don't think like us, don't have the same values, and have very different approaches to important questions than we do. But if that kind of serendipity is going to be allowed to flourish, I think that we have to have a cultural tolerance for mess. And I see this, the inability of the city to be able to actually grasp this in all kinds of places. Every day I see it across the street from my house. I live up by the drive, and we got a great little park right across. I think the official name is Victoria Park. It's kind of at Salisbury and between Kitchener and Grant. And they redid the park last year. They spent maybe 2 years ago. They did a victory in the city strike, and they redid the park. They put in all these new kind of playground equipment. They put in all kinds of new paths and all kinds of stuff. They did a great job of it in all kinds of ways. Many of you planners are here involved in redesigning that park. They did a really nice job on the park. But I noticed as soon as they got finished with the park, people didn't really know how to inhabit it. People were staying away from it. That's a famously well-used park. We call it Man Down Park because there's always at least one man down in it. And my kids used to like to go out and watch the ambulances come in the summer. But the park took a long time to recover its kind of vitality, its kind of life. And in large respect, I think that's because the park was ringed. I counted 22 signs. In the new version of the park. 22 signs telling you how long your dog's leash could be, how long you could spend in the park, when it was closed, when it was open, where you had to walk, where you had to stand. And it took some people some time to figure out how to re-inhabit that park. And its attempt to marionette how that park was used, the city began to suck a lot of its life out of it. So I would say the first thing in allowing public places to become common is to allow them to develop a certain kind of mess, a certain kind of common mess. The second thing I would say is that there has to actually be a capacity to accept real public participation. And that public participation has to be what Christopher Alexander, who many of you know, calls a creed. A city, it can't be choreographed if it's going to have those serendipitous kind of qualities to it. It has to emerge bit by bit, piece by piece, little bit by little bit, and that has to happen from below. That has to become a living city. That is to say, it has to develop enigmatically in ways that can never be developed on a piece of paper. And the one example that I would give, maybe the very best example, is in Cuba. And probably many of you have been to Havana. And you'll know that after the fall of the Soviet Union, that Cuba's food supply got cut off rather drastically. It was sprayed full of food stopped coming from the Eastern Bloc. But not only did food stop coming, gas stopped coming, fertilizer stopped coming, pesticides stopped coming. So not only did the country of Cuba and the city of Havana not have enough food to eat, but they couldn't grow enough because the industrial agricultural system didn't have its fertilizer and its pesticides input. And even more than that, the food they could grow, they couldn't get to the city of Havana because they didn't have enough gas to fill the trucks with. So in the course of about a year, the average citizen of Havana lost about 25 pounds. People were freaking starving. And what people did was what, pretty much everybody would do was what we would do, I like to think, which is to start growing food. And if you go to Havana now, what you'll see in a very dense urban environment is a total riot of gardens. Coffee cans, rooftops, back alleys, in front of libraries, behind hospitals. People are growing food everywhere. And in short order, the government of Havana and the government of Cuba began to jump on board and began to provide seeds, began to provide some expertise, began to provide some tools and some public space. But the recovery of and the re-inhabitation of common space in Cuba, and Havana in particular, it came from below. You could never mandate that, you could never ask people to do it, but not only in staving off hunger and redeveloping the city, but also in reconfiguring public space and making huge swaths of public space actually commonly inhabited. It had to come from below. So the last thing I'll offer you is that if I could be so respectfully rude and to say that I don't think we need a public space in this city. I don't think we need a public gathering space. I don't think we need a public square at all. In fact, I think that would be counterproductive to developing an unfolding and a creative, living city. I think we need what Colin Ward once said. He said, we don't need a mass answer. We need a mass of answers. And I think that I would call into question the actual question that's being asked of you here tonight, which is to develop, and I'm not entirely sure, and I really like many of the designs here, but at some way, I think the project of asking people to design one grand public square where we can all come together, I think, suggests a certain kind of city, and that is the kind of city that I'm down for, frankly speaking. What I'm down for is a city that is absolutely full of commonplaces. Places that are not planned, places that are not managed, places that are not marioneted, places that fall outside of Foucauldian governmentality. I'm not interested in my conduct being conducted such. What I'm interested in is a city entirely full of places that people can inhabit and build in. I think what we need is a living city, a city that is allowed to unfold. And I think that can really only happen from everyday people. Thanks so much for your patience.